Okay, so good morning, everybody, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar organized by SCORAI, the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative. I know it's very early in the western parts of the United States, but it's very late in Japan, where Louis is located. So we are very pleased to have Louis Akenji from IGES in Tokyo, Japan, and Vanessa Timmer from One Earth in Vancouver, but also from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, to present for us this morning on the on the subject of the 1.5 degree lifestyle report that Louis, together with a consortium of other organizations, has just issued a few weeks ago. So after Louis' presentation, we will have another short presentation by Vanessa Timmer about the Beacon for Sustainable Living report that is complementary to the report that Louis is going to talk about. So after the two presentations, we will have a question and answer and discussion. In order to do that, you can write in the chat box your question, or you can just write that you want to ask a question. You can also make questions and comments during the presentations in the chat box. We are not going to take questions during the presentations, but after the presentations are finished, Vanessa, if you indicate that you will ask a question, Vanessa will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. You are free to turn on or off your video at any time during the presentation and during the question and answer. But if you pose a question, we would appreciate if we could see you on the video. It makes it more lively and interesting. So without further ado, we are going to get started. So I turn it over to Louis, and I will mute myself.
Let's see if this works. Please confirm if you can hear me and see me.
We can hear you.
We can hear you
Right.
and see you. Great.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. And I know it's a bit of an ungodly hour where you are now, especially in North America. It's 10 p.m. here on a Friday night. So it seems a particularly interesting time to talk about 1.5 degree lifestyles. And what I'm hoping to do over the next, say, 20 minutes is to walk you through a report that we've just published and some of the messages that are in there. It's unfortunate to say the message that is here has been sort of come out in different forms over the last 1 year, and the same warning about the urgency of driving towards sustainability. But hardly any report has gone as far and as detailed as talking about lifestyles as we have done here. So what I would like you to do, or what I would like to do, is walk you through the research that we have done, the publication and the messages in it, and also to start talking about the implications of the work that we are doing. When I say we, I mean we as a community of people trying to encourage a sustainable living. My name is Louis Akenji. I'm a program director with the Institute for Sustainable, with the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. So we've had the philosophical question, and usually it's to be or not to be. But we know that over the last century, we're trying to reframe that question to have or not to have. And lately, people within our community, I mean SCORAI, other organizations involved in sustainability, are now trying to wrestle with reframing that. And lately we're asking, is it to be or to have? Or maybe to be and to have. I'm not sure which one. But it's quite important that as we think about the work we're doing, and as we see the numbers come out of this report, we consider that no one really intentionally wants to go out and harm the environment when they go about their everyday living. The environmental impacts of everyday living is just really unintended consequences of people trying to pursue their dreams, trying to pursue well-being. People consume for lots of different reasons. They consume to meet essential needs, to meet social expectations. You want to dress nice when you meet your friends. They consume to satisfy personal desires that they have, which are maybe engineered by society. Sometimes we consume because we are railroaded to. We don't have any other option than to go with what is available. And over the last few decades, we're noticing, especially with the prevalence of technology, a flattening of trends when we're looking at consumption and production systems. There's the flattening of trend between the consumer and the producer. We now talk of prosumers, for example. Between social trends and individualization, we talk about mass customization nowadays. About ownership structures, servicizing is a typical example. Emerging of online and offline living, people talking about a work-life balance. And we're seeing a proliferation of information, but not necessarily knowledge, but somehow we have the technology that is beginning to merge this too. Just Google it, they say. And of course, traditional services are getting digitalized. So we see this, and the claim here is that it is driving us towards sustainability. There's the argument that it is not by others, but the interesting thing is to look at what the numbers actually say about where we are. Which is why this report, I actually happen to have a copy of it here with me. 1.5 degrees lifestyles, targets and options for reducing lifestyle carbon footprints. It's a collaborative effort between the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, the team I lead, and our colleagues at DMAT and Aalto University, with financial support from CITRA, KR Foundation, and from IGES. Most of you might know Michael Lettenmeyer, who has been involved here, Ryu Koide, who is a colleague of mine who has been involved, and several other colleagues who contributed to this. We launched this at the World Resources Forum several weeks back in Antwerp, Belgium. And you might have read about it in the media. It was covered by the Associated Press, NBC, and many other outlets. So what is it that we try to do here? Quite often when we talk about climate, the scenarios that we depend upon are based on energy systems and the effects of technology. But we started asking the question, what if the technological claims we're making are not wholly reliable and we really need to depend on changes in our ways of living? But quite often, consumption is seen as a hot potato issue, especially by national governments and corporations. Our entire system depends on the economy doing well, which depends upon consumption in a way that has been defined to be heavily dependent on on the biophysical systems that are supposed to sustain us, and which we know that we're now transgressing. And quite often when we link consumption and lifestyles, especially around climate change, the debate has usually focused on territorial emissions rather than value chains worldwide. Especially we know that we're getting very globalized and there's embodied emissions in consumption, but these are usually not counted when we focus on territorial emissions. And despite all the attempts our governments would claim that they have made, quite often it is a case of consumer scapegoatism. I've talked about this repeatedly, where we're promoting green consumerism and very minor incremental changes or changing fringe elements rather than core aspects that are heavily burdening our natural environment. So what approach did we take with this? I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to change the settings of this so I don't get it interfering with the system here. All right, so our project approach was to look at the current carbon footprint and look at the goal, the aspirational 1.5 degree goal under the climate regime, especially in the Paris Agreement, and to try to understand where the hotspots are, and then to try to get what hotspots are especially due to the way we live. So we've coined lifestyle carbon footprints, and we've tried to set targets for, especially for 2050, but also to look at intermediary targets for 2030 and 2040. And then we've gone further and looking at the reduction potentials out there, providing a few options, which might begin to indicate which directions we could take if we're going to lower our lifestyle carbon footprint. Now, it is quite important to clarify at this stage that we did not run scenarios by ourselves. We depended on publications that have already been peer-reviewed. Some of them included in the assessment report, the database run by the IPCC, but also coming from very well-renowned publications. A few of them are listed here, and we're not going to go through all of this, and in the interest of time, please do not punish me to go through every detail that is here. But what I would like you to focus on is the term lifestyle carbon footprint, which we have used here. And it is pretty much footprints which are based on consumption-based accounting. And we define lifestyle carbon footprints as greenhouse gas emissions that are directly emitted and indirectly induced from household consumption, excluding those induced by government consumption and capital formation. So really the calculations we have done here, you can't say we're going to blame all of it on, say, just what is happening in other countries. It is really a reflection of the consumption that we're undertaking in our various countries. It embodies the production in foreign countries, especially in goods that we import. What we've done, we've looked at the typical domains which you must be familiar with by now: food, mobility, housing, consumer goods, leisure, and services. And we've calculated this looking at the various scenarios that I showed before, looking at a time frame between now and 2100. Let's say a 100-year time frame. But what I would really like you to focus on is between now and 2050, because at least this has a little bit more clarity, especially dependability in terms of the data that is out there. And if you look very carefully here on this graph that is shown here, we're currently at 4.5 tons per capita per person. And I would like to suggest that you focus on the green line that is there. I'm not going to talk about all the other scenarios. Let's just focus on the 1.5 degree one, which is the green line. And if you look very carefully, we're now at about 5 tons per capita per person. And by 2050, we need to be at 0.7 tons per capita per person per year. Now, that is very drastic. Just to show you exactly how serious these numbers are, I'm going to show you for 5 countries which we try to concentrate on. So we looked at the case of Finland, we looked at Japan, and to look at also emerging economies, we looked at the case of China, Brazil, and India. Now, these 5 countries, remember, we have a 2030 target to get down to about 3 tons per person per year, and to about 1 ton per person per year in 2050. Now, what does this say in terms of the distance between where we are today, in the case of Finland, Japan, China, Brazil, and India, and where we need to be? This is the sort of reduction we're thinking about. In Finland, between now and 2030, you need to go down by 90%, by 73%, I'm sorry, and by 90% before 2050. That is a radical reduction. And there's really hardly any way of explaining this. I've heard people say this is alarming. You can't just put out numbers like this. But I think when we talk about lifestyles and the urgency of transitioning, it's quite important that people begin to understand what is under the hood here, to start opening up this black box behind the calculations. Of course, you can see from these graphs the share for nutrition, housing, mobility, consumer goods, and leisure and services. I am going to try to go through a breakdown of this to show where the hotspots are and the intensity for each one of these domains. Quite important to mention at this stage is that we're calculating household share of total footprints to be about 72%. Now, it might not apply to every country, but this is the most reliable number that we could find. Another thing to mention is that we've taken an equity perspective, and we've distributed emissions equally across the globe. So we do not assume that some people have the right to emit higher than others. Another thing I should also mention is that we've tried to reduce the impact of technology as much as possible. So you could say that it's a silver lining in that if our technology surprises us and somehow we can manage to deal with this situation technologically, then that's just a bonus. But what we're looking at here is just the scenarios that are dealing with behavioral change. Now, I've tried to break this down for different countries, but first, I've shown you the first 5 countries, but because this was launched in Belgium, I also calculated it for Belgium. It turned out to be quite terrible. Belgium is now at 12.2 tons per person per year, and the reductions within the next 12 years are about 80%, and more than 90% before 2050. I should clarify that the figures you see to the left are carbon footprints, not lifestyle carbon footprints. Now, let's take nutrition, housing, and mobility as examples to break down, especially for Finland and Japan. These are two countries that we try to go into much more. The dotted lines you see are for 2030. For 2030, that's the black one. 2040, that's the orange one, and 2050, that is the blue one. And what this skyline charts begin to show you are two things. One, a combination of the intensity of whatever it is that we're consuming and the amount of consumption. Now, these are the two things you need to keep in mind: how much we're consuming and the impact of each unit of that consumption on the environment. And what you begin to see very clearly here is the case of meat, for example, which is the intensity is extremely high. Thankfully, meat consumption is not as much as dairy consumption. But even so, you can see that one of the areas where we need to start cutting down immediately is meat consumption. In Japan, there's less meat consumed than in Finland, but the intensity of meat consumption in Japan is really very high compared to Finland. In both cases, they're extremely high. This is the case with China. It's the case with Brazil. It's the case with India. You see, on the other hand, however, how the intensity of vegetables compared to meat is very low. Another way of presenting this information is using the diagrams we have here. Let's take the case of Finland, for example. Consumption of meat is fairly small compared to, for example, consumption of beverages. But the intensity of meat consumption is so high that despite a small amount of meat consumption, the overall impact of it is really high within the nutrition balance. One very interesting one, let me see, beverage consumption. Here, for example, let's say alcohol consumption. It turns out that beverages that have alcohol in them tend to have higher intensity than non-alcoholic beverages. But you can also tell here that although there's a lot of alcohol consumption in countries like Japan and Finland, the intensity is not that terribly high. These things have a funny way of showing up. So when things get really hard, we might need to resort to alcohol there. I don't know whether that is sustainable or not sustainable. That's a whole different conversation. Housing tells a similar story. You can see most of the consumption of energy in housing goes to heating and cooling. We can tell in the case of Japan, because of the very low amount of renewable, the high dependence on non-renewable energy, the intensity is really high. For Finland, because of district heating, for example, the intensity of household heating the house is fairly low compared to what you find in Japan. In both cases, anyway, there's still a need for radical reduction. You get the same information here, but with a slightly different form of presentation. And for mobility, one of the more interesting ones we have looked at, you see exactly the impact of private car use here. Now, I need to be a bit careful because the one on airplanes is deceptively small. This is because flying that is for business purposes is not allocated to individual lifestyles, but to the company. And you could argue that we should have calculated this with individual lifestyles, but I would really leave that up to you. What I would like to clarify, however, is that the impact of flying is really quite it's worse than is shown here, and it's far worse per unit than in using private cars. And also because the science is beginning to show that emissions from flying are much more dangerous because they're emitted at a higher altitude. So I do not in any way intend to show that flying is not as terrible for the environment here. It's just the methodology we've used that ends up presenting it in this manner. You have the same thing here. Again, the emphasis on car usership, car usage and its impact on the environment, compared, for example, to bicycle use, where you see it's used fairly little, but even so, you can hardly see the impact of bicycle use in Japan or Finland. Now, one of the things we do in the report is try to get into, we looked at this and we got quite frustrated ourselves, and we started thinking, we can't just publish something like this without beginning to show directions going forward. And I should mention here that the calculations we've done are based on analysis by other researchers. So we reviewed publications that are done for different countries, looking at options that could help move us closer to 1.5. And so it's very difficult for us to always claim that the reductions that we show here, or the options that we show here, are in keeping with the 1.5 calculation that we have done. But we felt the need to look at the wider literature and to begin to find solutions there so we can make recommendations. There are three key approaches that we recommend here. Those of you that have worked with me on previous projects would know about the concept of absolute reduction. So this is in reducing physical amounts of goods or services that are being consumed, as well as avoiding certain options completely. So we could talk about reduction of meat, for example, and some of the more intensive options that we could just completely avoid because they're too unsustainable. The second option in reducing our impact is towards efficiency improvement. And in this case, it's especially the more technological focused aspect. Think of it as, for example, electric car use instead of fossil fuel based, fossil fuel powered cars. The next one, the third one here is shifting modes. So for example, instead of using your private car, you begin to use a less intensive mode, such as public transportation. And what to keep in mind here, we've talked about the rebound effect. What to keep in mind here is that it's quite possible that especially in terms of efficiency improvements or even modal shifts, if the sheer amount of consumption that is undertaken under each one of these options, if the total amount of consumption increases, then it offsets the efficiency gains that have been accrued due to technological improvements or due to changes from one mode to another. And of course, we know about the role of lock-ins. While we're shifting modes, we should be careful to make sure that we do not lock people into new modes that are ultimately unsustainable for them. I'd like to mention a few things here that do not necessarily come across in this report very sharply. The element of well-being is not very strongly reflected in this report. We do talk about equity, but not too much about well-being. Another thing that is not that of course is not here is the aspect of material, the material intensity. So we're looking primarily at the material footprint. We're looking primarily at greenhouse gas emissions and not material footprints. It's very possible to interpret some of these in ways that are materially more intensive than necessarily the carbon intensity would show. So I beg you to understand that the different indicators might end up showing sometimes slightly different results, but also sometimes very significantly different results. Now, a few of the options we look at, we try to estimate for different countries and looking at different options. In this case, for example, we're looking at nutrition, and in the case of Finland. So you can see how a vegan diet can significantly get us much closer to our sustainability target than, say, food production efficiency improvement. So if more people were to switch to veganism, it would, of course, have a better impact. Now, there's a certain cultural sensitivity to this, which I would like to bring forth. We've been talking to our Japanese colleagues and other residents of Japan, and the notion of veganism is quite an unusual one here. And so there are cultural aspects that come into play here, which would be very difficult to translate from one culture to the next. There's a sensitivity to that which we need to bear in mind. And another thing we talk about in the report is adoption rates. So the idea is that although one option could be sustainable, the rate of adoption of that option is very important. So let's say a vegetarian diet, for example. You could say you become vegetarian once a week or 1 week every month. Or and in this case, you say just 50% of the population adopts that. Or you say the entire population adopts vegetarianism, and they go for it maybe once a month or once a week, 1 day a week, or one meal every Monday. So we need to be very careful what the adoption rate we're using here is, just to make sure that we do not confuse people to think that automatically a limited set of people in a limited set of the population adopting it is going to have this sort of overall impact that is being presented here. Another example here, not to take up too much time, is mobility. And you can see, compare car-free traveling, which is the very first one there, to say ride sharing. The impact of ride sharing certainly doesn't look too large compared to what it would mean if most of us started using public transportation. And also another interesting one is living closer to the workplace. The more people live closer to the workplace, it would have quite a significant impact on the burden we're placing on the environment. So again, I'd like to reiterate the numbers that are here. The long-term targets for lifestyle carbon footprints that are compatible with the 1.5 degree centigrade aspirational target under the Paris Agreement. 2.5 for the year 2030, 1.4 for 2040, and 0.7 tons per CO2 equivalent per capita for 2050. Now, this is not just for industrialized countries. It is also for industrializing countries, where we see need for significant reductions. In the case of Brazil, China, and India, for example, which I already showed, there's the need to reduce between 25 and 80% by 2050. And these are countries that still need to meet the basic needs of their citizens. These are countries that are powering on with coal-fired power plants. These are countries where large numbers of the population still live in poverty. So a combination of that and already the need for reduction can already tell you what dangerous territory we are in right now. And we know, of course, that the three key areas, nutrition, housing, and mobility, contribute to about 75% of the total environmental impact from lifestyles. And these are areas which, if we focus on, it could start bringing significant reductions. There's another discussion to be had whether we should approach this using really these domains, or we should use larger profiles that incorporate the interlinkages among these domains. But I will not get into that here. And sorry, I'm going to skip this and try to wrap up pretty fast. So some of the things we need to start looking at the implications here are that clearly we need to give up certain things. It's not really, we're either going to have to give it up sooner than later, or we're going to be forced to give them up when the impacts of our consumption start kicking in. And the small action trap that we've gotten used to, we need to skip that and start looking at very large scale actions that can start having very immediate effects. And the other thing to understand here is these numbers are quite threatening. When I think of Belgium, for example, that has more than 90% needs more than 90% reduction before 2050. It's really unprecedented. No organization really has a capacity, or no organization can clearly tell us how we would absorb this degree of reduction. And so all the scenarios that we're bringing out, the solutions that we're bringing out, tweaking current lifestyles around the periphery, are just not going to do it. We're going to need to reimagine completely a very different way of living, and to start accepting very radical solutions in ways that it's not only going to depend on the technology, on the technological inventions that we're talking about nowadays. Even if those begin to have impact, there's no indication that it is going to have a significant enough impact to meet the degree of reductions that this report highlights. And we also need new institutions. Our governments are famously outdated in terms of how they need to approach this problem. The business models that we have right now are not really dealing with the issue appropriately. And we need to start looking beyond just the marketplace. Quite often we're thinking in terms of the economy. We're thinking in terms of whether the market can accommodate such options or not. But there's clear indication that the market is not designed to handle this. But even solutions that go to the market might not be enough. We need to start going out of the marketplace to find other ways of addressing this problem. And to remind everyone again, although this is really talking about lifestyles, the burden is not just on individuals and households. We need to be very clear about this. It needs a concerted effort of individuals making very voluntary changes, sometimes not necessarily voluntary. That's a different conversation. But also governments and businesses beginning to change the context within which consumption is taking place. And the diagram that I have before you is an attempt to sort of cluster what drives our consumption into ways that begin to show that there are certain things that can be controlled by the individual, and there are some that just go beyond the ability of the individual to control. So right in the middle, we have our basic needs and desires. This includes the identity, your identity, freedom, the need for affection, the need to participate in society, need for subsistence. And all of these drivers, but just after that, just slightly the layer after that is talking about the personal situation. What is your age? What are your peers? What do they like or not like? What type of education do you have? What is your sex? What income do you have? All of this predetermine how you go about meeting those, trying to meet those needs and desires that are at the center there. But slightly outside of that is the economy, the infrastructure, the politics. This is what constitutes the socio-technical conditions that frame our choices. And these are not things that individuals can necessarily change. And individuals cannot necessarily change the politics. You can contribute to it, but you cannot change. There's certain infrastructure that locks us in, which you cannot change. The economy and individual cannot always change that. And just outside of this socio-technical conditions is the physical boundaries, what we sometimes refer to as the planetary boundaries. I put this up to make sure that we do not rush to start saying individuals need to take all the responsibility here, but that we really need to have take a very concerted approach where everyone is playing some sort of a role. Again, these are the organizations that have been involved in this report, and my colleagues, Michael Lettenmeyer, Vivi, Rio, and Ariane, who were quite instrumental in the publication. So that would be it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louis. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Louis, thank you very much for a very clear and an extremely important and interesting presentation. Thank you so much. So before we go to the discussion, I will now give the floor to Vanessa to talk about Beacon for Sustainable Living. Vanessa.
Wonderful. Thanks, Philip. Yes, and as you say, it really builds on each other. So the Beacon for Sustainable Living, I'm just going to open the slides up, is actually a project that Louis and myself are leading with a number of colleagues around how do we actually, remain within our carbon budget requires these transformations in our ways of living, as Louis was just mentioning. And so how do we even talk about this transformation? So what I'm about to show you just for the next few minutes is some of the assumptions we've made in developing the Beacon project about what kind of ways we're getting stuck in thinking about these transformations in our ways of living. I'll just give you a couple of examples from our initial survey and then show you a few projects that this work is building on as a way of setting the context. So the Beacon actually is aiming to overcome a series of different challenges. And as I'm going through these, I'd be very interested for those of you on the call to let me know if we're framing this accurately or if there's ones we're missing. So one thing we're thinking that we need to overcome is what Louis was just mentioning, a lack of clarity around what sustainable living really means. And I noticed, Philip, you placed in the chat box that you were quite surprised about the difference between wasted food and plant-rich diets and how much of a larger impact shifting to a plant-rich diet has in terms of our carbon footprint. So this kind of strategic insight that Lewis and the team that did the 1.5 degree lifestyles report is getting at, I think, is that evidence base is really critical, and it translates into scientific reports, but we can also look to real world practices, including traditional practices that could be picked up in a much broader way. So that's the first thing we're overcoming. The second thing that we're looking at is overcoming the hesitation with giving people bad news about their daily lives. So what Lewis was mentioning about the scale of change that we're talking about, that could seem quite overwhelming for people. And Lewis also mentioned that in the 1.5 degree lifestyles report, there's less of a focus on well-being. However, I think one of the most powerful things we as a SCORAI community could do is link, and many of us on this call are doing this, link this evidence base with the benefits to One Planet Living, health and well-being, and start from those basic needs, those basic values, and offer a solutions orientation to this. So as we start looking at those absolute reductions, what are we actually gaining when we have a plant-rich diet or live in walkable communities or are connected more to beyond materialism, to a richer, more meaningful life that isn't based in material consumption? So that's, I think, part of what we're wanting to do with the Beacon, is really make those connections between the evidence base and these benefits clear. We also are looking at overcoming the discomfort faced with the implications on our own personal lives. And, you know, I think all of us struggle with, when we look at this data, how do we actually incorporate this into how we live our lives? And I think we really need support from each other and an enabling context to making these transitions. So part of what we'll be doing in the Beacon is also directing people for kind of community support, but also for insights on how these larger systems need to shift. We also feel like we're needing to overcome the sense that people feel quite alone and calling for radical change in our lifestyles. Oftentimes when people are making changes in their own lives, they feel that they're maybe outside of the mainstream. So how can we actually reflect back? And that's what we'll be working on with the Beacon, that we're part of a larger movement, a very large movement, transforming to sustainable living and connecting the individuals and communities who share this goal. And, you know, I think there's a bit of an avoidance to engage in kind of difficult and disruptive conversations around this topic, because it really does test the limits of public and political acceptability. This is a really, as Lewis said, a hot potato issue. It can really be very challenging for people to speak about our daily lives and think about these transformations. And I think sometimes there's a real political, we're in this kind of, it's a very political conversation as well. So how can we continue to build the alliance that responds to any pushbacks that we might have, but also use any resistance or political debate as a springboard for wider engagement? And we're also wanting to overcome this sense of hopelessness, the belief that the scale of transformation, this transition, is impossible. So the Beacon is really about reinforcing active hope and agency by showing the solutions, kind of options that we were looking at in the 1.5 degree report, also looking at cases of One Planet Living today, and, you know, reimagining our ways of living, as Lewis mentioned, these alternative sustainable living futures. So those are the things we feel like the Beacon is really meant to address, and if there might be ones that you think of as well, we can talk about that in a moment. So in the end, the Beacon is really a pulling together and a creation of transformative communications materials that equip us to talk about this transformation in our ways of living, shift the discourse in our mindset, and be backed by this kind of online hub of curated references, cases, visions that reinforce these transformative solutions, and of course a connective place for the alliance of actors working on catalyzing sustainable living. We're working with the producer of the Story of Stuff project, the Story of Stuff films, Erica Wright, and she's got a long history of working on how we translate some of these complex ideas into mainstream storytelling and do that in a way that builds movements and addresses power and privilege to shift our kind of towards collaborative leadership towards this. We'd be also working with the team that she has called Provoke, that are a kind of communications team that's really steeped in social change and catalyzing transformative communications for this type of sustainability and regenerative economies. So the arc of the Beacon for Sustainable Living, in this first year of the 2-year project, we're starting with a review of sustainable living communications, also supported by Nanaki Vish, who's at One Earth. We're looking at the leadership narrative. What's the tone of the Beacon? Identifying the values that would be underpinning it, connecting with yourselves and others about this project. And then we'll be prototyping. Lewis and myself will be working with Erica and with others. How do we test out different ways of talking about this transformation and sustainable living? We'll be forming an advisory board in May and working with partners and developing that online hub that I mentioned. In year 2, we're going to be connecting with a number of influential nodes. So we're in conversation with a few networks that would be testing out different communications prototypes, and that'll allow us to iterate it and develop it further, and of course refine the online hub platform and continue to engage in expanding alliance of people. So that's the overview of the Beacon. I'd be very interested to hear where you've seen transformative communications in this field before, what other things you think we might be overcoming. Just to give you a sneak peek into some of the communications approaches that we're looking at in this scan. Here's one that Nanaki found, the Zero Waste Iftar Challenge. This is really looking at, it's actually a social media campaign around Ramadan, the Islamic month of blessings, and it's really about connecting Ramadan to not only a month of blessings for the community, but also for planet Earth. So this is a really interesting intersection of a cultural context in which the sustainable living discussion is happening within a community. Here's a completely different community. This is Trash Tiki. These are 2 bartenders who are using wasted food to create cocktails, and they're really engaging the entire cocktail and kind of nighttime bar community and thinking about sustainable living. So what Lewis was mentioning before about the footprint of alcoholic beverages, they're really kind of looking at how do we start to shift the kinds of products that go into those beverages. And then here's another challenge. The Swedish government worked with a community in Hanoi, Vietnam, to do a 7-day sustainable living challenge. So this interesting global connection around creating an actual challenge as a way of transforming how people think about sustainable ways of living. And this has opportunities to adapt these kinds of challenges all around the planet in different contexts. So I'll just take a final few moments to show you 2 projects that this Beacon for Sustainable Living is building on. The first is a project that I worked with Philip and Helena on and with the SCORAI community, TELUS Institute, Climate Access, including Kara Pike and the One Earth team, as well as the United Nations Environment Program, on fostering and communicating sustainable lifestyles. So I'm just going to show you these principles, and some of you might know this very well because you advised us on it, and others, this might be the first time seeing this report that was released a couple of years ago. We talked about how do you kind of develop sustainable lifestyles initiatives and campaigns, and we developed this set of a kind of a roadmap of a set of principles. So some of these are very recognizable from any communications initiative. Of course, we need to understand our audience and start from those basic needs, those values that Lewis was mentioning as well. How do we make these communications approaches be engaged in a participatory, relevant, and grounded way to the stakeholders that we're engaging? Step 2 is quite interesting because we want to set goals around impact that we're just talking about around the 1.5 degree living. And what I was just mentioning, I think the most powerful thing we can do as a community is connect that impact with better living. So focusing on our aspirations around equity and well-being. There's also a range of strategies that many of us on this webinar are engaging in. As Lewis was mentioning, thinking about the individual as being embedded in a larger system, and that this system is also dynamic over time. So he was mentioning adoption rates. One of the most powerful things we can do in terms of working on sustainable living, sorry, let me just go back, is to think about how we can shift habits in, for example, key life stages in people's lives. Our daily habits can be quite locked in, but when we move or retire or have a child or immigrate to a new place, or become a student for the first time in a university or college or shift jobs, these moments of life transitions you know, the University of Surrey has taken a big look at this, this life stages and transitions as a powerful place for shifting habits towards sustainable living. So, and the thing is, at those moments, the kinds of absolute reductions, modal shifts, and efficiency gains that Lewis was mentioning, if people are supported at those life stages and transitions, we could really see a shift in habits. So not necessarily expecting them to do it on their own, but really providing the community systems around them to create new practices in those life stages and transitions. Lewis also mentioned the need to be sensitive to different contexts. This sustainable way of living is deeply diverse. How do we enable many different expressions of 1.5 degree lifestyles or one planet living? And we know that people's lives change not just on their own, but are influenced by the communities that they're engaged in. So the importance of not just addressing individuals, but looking at collective action in neighborhoods, community groups, faith groups, sports groups, bartenders, schools, all sorts of different kinds of collective action that's possible. And of course, we want to be responsive over time, so learn together about how to communicate differently. Let me just show you a couple of examples from this report. The first is the China Dream program in China that employed culturally relevant practices to focus in on this campaign framing of living more, not just having more. And what we ended up seeing there is that there's this campaign taps into kind of the emotional connections of people. Sorry, did I just end my sharing? No, this is good. Of people in China who are visualizing their own understanding of their quality of life, really using the values and unique perspectives that are based in, for example, Chinese value around harmony and prosperity as two key concepts in the Chinese culture. The Repair Cafe is another case study you can see of a way in which a group has spanned across 29 countries to engage people on repair, but also engaged a kind of communications campaign within that larger initiative. And the way they do that communication can really teach us a lot about how to do this sustainable living communications well. So for example, each Repair Cafe is driven by local organizations and volunteers, and so they really tailor the campaign messages to those particular communities. So the communication takeaways from Repair Cafes is that they connect with these local leaders to act, but focus not just on stuff, but on repairing communities. So really bringing people together around the repair initiatives. They also, yes?
Sorry, you stopped sharing your screen.
Oh, I did stop sharing my screen. Thank you for letting me know, Sylvia. Let me just go back and share it again. I just noticed
so we saw the Chinese, not the Repair Cafe. Yeah, exactly.
Perfect, great, perfect. So there's China Dream, and let me just show you the Repair Cafe here. So this is where they really used local organizations in 29 countries and really tailored their communications to this, but also focused on this framing. It's about repairing communities, not just stuff, and scaling efforts across these 29 countries by providing this flexible framework. And people take selfies with the things that they repair so that you can see, you know, give that feedback loop about how much this repair culture is spreading. So I want to end with a kind of a coming soon of another initiative that Lewis and I have been engaged in, and it's the Envisioning Future Low Carbon Lifestyles and Transitioning Instruments. And this is the group that's been really working on this with IGES and One Earth, as well as strategic design scenarios design firm based in Brussels. And we've also had a wide range of advisors, including Sylvia, who you just heard, and many others who have been working with us on thinking about this envisioning of sustainable lifestyles. And one of them is Blake Robinson, who's from South Africa, and he already developed a kind of vision of how this Cape Town slum we could envision what daily life might look like if this community shifted towards sustainability. And he developed one futures vision, which is this one, which is a typical African vision of what sustainable or what a future might look like, this kind of smart city. So you see sharing platforms active here, but it's also a very militarized future, and it also has deep inequality. So Blake's work with this designer was to pose questions about whether or not this typical way of thinking about our transformed ways of living might have these downsides. And in fact, could we not get much more imaginative about what an African future daily life might look like? And so this was their first attempt to start to think about what could that look like. And as part of this project and this report that's coming out in June, we're going to be showing some of the more recent visions of what possible sustainable living futures could look like, and some principles and gaps that we might want to address as we start to envision the future. So those will also feed into the Beacon for Sustainable Living. The Beacon itself, I welcome you to connect with me and with Louis about that, and be very interested to hear what transformative communications you've seen, what things we need to overcome, and what things you've seen work in envisioning sustainable lifestyles and communicating them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Wonderful project, and we're really thrilled to hear about it. So before I open it for discussion, I just a very short summary. So Louis basically was more analytical, and he posed the challenges that we need to overcome in order to go to 1.5 degrees Celsius. He points, but he actually points in his report at targets. It's very clear where the biggest buck for reduction carbon is going to be get. That is car driving, flying, our food, especially meat eating. Also the sizes of our houses are very important. So these are big challenges. And then Vanessa pointed out at initiatives and possibilities to actually get at these challenges. It is not an individual challenge. It is very much a collective endeavor. We need to work in with organizations and institutions to transform our lifestyles. So after this very extremely too short summary, I open the floor for questions. So please unmute yourself or raise your hand. I think you have to.
You just need to put if you'd like to ask a question, just place it within the chat box.
Yes.
I just wanted to note that just as we're getting started, Sylvia, you mentioned that the term beacon was something you weren't familiar with. And the reason we selected it was because a beacon is both an urgent signal often, but it's also about having a light from a larger or a higher perspective. So often beacons are the things that guide ships at night to avoid rocky shores. And the other thing is that a beacon is often used to speak about large-scale meta values that we need in society. So being a beacon for democracy, for example. So for all of those reasons, we thought it was such a wonderful phrase for talking about how do we garner attention towards the transformative nature of this challenge.
Okay. Who wants to pose a question or a comment? You can type in the chat box if you want to ask Vanessa.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Halina, go ahead.
Okay, let me start. Right. So this, should I open the camera also or not?
Yeah, please do, because then we can see you.
Like this? Yeah,
yes,
like
yes,
this?
Yes.
Sorry, I haven't combed my hair yet today. So, all right, I have two questions, comments, and they're quite different, so we can take them in any way, in any order we want. So one is, let me just say, wonderful project, really. I am especially, perhaps because I knew quite a bit about the material that Louis presented, I am especially taken by what Vanessa presented, this whole idea of communicating and having a conversation and envisioning. But it struck me when you gave examples, Vanessa, of food, these few small examples that you gave, you highlighted food waste, which is really a minor part of the food problem. right? And a lot of people focus on food waste has become a big trendy thing in the area where I live, Massachusetts, in the US. And people associated it with not throwing away leftovers, all right? So what it means is we know the big picture, but we often end up focusing on relatively minor changes in the big system. So that's one observation. The other one is, I know this project is about communication, so you focus on that, but we need to also talk about policy. And I mean local policies. Oftentimes when people think of policy for sustainability, they think about price on carbon and advancing renewable technologies. And pricing of carbon is going to have very positive effects in the production area, but not so much in the consumption area. So we need local policies. How do you shift people who can afford very high living to a much more modest living, which when they can afford the big living and the 4,000 square foot house, which is what I see in the area where I live, because it's quite a prosperous area. And for that, we need local policies. Communication is not going to take us there. So that's my call, and just say that that's what I am working on, local policies that are going to drive changes in lifestyle.
Thank you, Alina. So Louis or Vanessa, who wants to go first?
Yeah, I know this is a great point, Alina. And the wasted food is interesting because, just to kind of go back to the first point, when we did our report for the UN Environment on sustainable lifestyles, options and opportunities, it was actually both plant-based diets and as well as plant-based diets and the wasted food were both contributors to the footprint in terms of where we want to place our focus. And so that's why I focused on the wasted food there. And I totally take your point that in terms of the communications, this is where we want to bring together this evidence base and make sure our focus within the communications is on some of the ways in which our sustainable ways of living are bringing us into the 1.5 degree lifestyles based on the evidence that we have on how to shift towards reduced footprints within our daily lives. So absolutely, the intention is for the beacon to be focused. And what we found in this initial scan, by the way, was that most communications projects out there right now are really focused on these separate domains that Louis was mentioning. And we have the sense that there's actually much more powerful entry points by looking at some of these systems-wide possibilities. So, for example, coming at the transformation in our ways of living by redefining well-being, or looking at how can, just to do a nod to the Glamours project from the European Union that really focused on consumption as being, actually they focused on time use with associated consumption patterns. And I know, Jaco, you're on the Quist is online with us and was very deeply involved with that. And I find that such a powerful way to think about it, because if you think about our consumption, the domain consumption is linked to how we spend our time. We can actually, if we have a much more time abundant society and are less constrained in time, that shifts all sorts of things, our mobility, what choices we make, how convenient, we might grab convenient food or quickly grab disposable products for a gift for our child's birthday party because we're rushed with time. So if we have a time abundance, then we can actually start to shift a whole bunch of domains. So looking at, and Louis has written about time use and its potential as well. I just think that these cross-cutting aspects that we can also look at when we look at the strategic way in for communicating in a transformative way about sustainable living.
So thank you, Vanessa. So we have a bunch of questions in the chat box. First, Vicky Sontag, and then a person called MA20. I don't know who he or she is. And then myself. So maybe, Vicky, you want to speak up for a few moments? The question that Vicky poses is, do you know of any examples of social transformation campaigns in which personal accountability based on feedback is integral to the campaign?
I might add to that. This is Vicky. I'm sitting
can you also
pajamas on the West Coast, so I'm going to keep the visuals muted. I have been a researcher in food waste, and on a personal level, you know, I have done my own food waste reduction piece. But there's a level of accountability and beyond the awareness that you need of your personal behavior, consumption patterns, that you need to sustain over time. And especially if you don't have that reinforced within your community, and I could say I have a high level community because I live in an eco-village that is focused on sustainability practices. I find it very hard to do it at a personal level. And so I was wondering if you had any examples of communities that might have taken on practices that based on feedback could help to sustain personal accountability and a focus on that.
Yeah, I can speak to that, Philip, if that's helpful.
Sure.
Okay. So thank you, Vicky. Yes, it's interesting. The eco-villages, as you say, have often a great built-in intentionality and, you know, and in many cases can actually really support those practices over time. Not always. There's been some research done that, you know, not necessarily are all eco-villages achieving the kind of footprint reductions that are needed, but many of them move us all in the right direction and can be looked to as real examples of how we might live differently and alternative ways of living that are deeply sustainable. So other examples, just to give you a couple, one is the One Planet Living projects that are run by Bioregional. They actually have a kind of built-in accountability and feedback mechanism, and now they're actually putting that online with an entire global framework on uploading your action plans, One Planet Living action plans. So in my region in British Columbia, there's One Planet Saanich that's quite active in starting to build that kind of accountability mechanism. At a very local level in Vancouver, we have a project called the Green Block Neighborhoods run by Evergreen, in which neighborhoods set an ecological footprint goal and work together as a community to achieve that. And I think there's also, Helena, you might want to speak to Penn South example in New York, which was just inevitably kind of connected and a sustainable community there. Another one that I am very fond of and often look to is Adina's work in Hungary with Green Dependent, in which there were communities that they've worked with, the green neighborhoods, that these were people living in Hungary who already have One Planet lives or very close to One Planet lives. And Green Dependent has worked with them to reinforce those ways of living because they're under such great pressure to increase their consumption. So I find really an interesting, that her work is so interesting because it's really about reinforcing the way those people live and celebrating that. And indeed, those neighborhoods have had that feedback mechanism where together they feel great pride now in terms of the way they live.
Thank you, Vanessa. So there was a question from MA20 about how to communicate to policymakers, urban planners, and other decision makers.
I'm MA20. I can.
What's your name?
Hi, Manisha.
It's Manisha.
Oh, Manisha, hi.
Hi. So the question I have is related, I think, as you know, as you pointed out, Louis, and you talked about Vanessa, as the need to think about absolute reductions in lifestyles goes to places like Brazil, India, and China, where the kind of the political systems have their own specific intricacies, right? Democracy and participation don't necessarily work the same ways in those places. So I'm thinking here specifically about the ways in which the 1.5 degree lifestyle, sustainable well-being, beacon communication can or should be targeted towards local decision makers who currently have their imaginaries and visions very much, set on the kind of smart, sustainable, traditional smart, sustainable urbanism that you pointed to, Vanessa. So in what ways are you all kind of engaged in, having targeted communication towards key decision makers in the cities of the global south, where a lot of this increased consumption is taking place? Is this possible? Is this necessary? That's my question.
Louis, did you want to speak to that? Yeah, so the only thing I want to say about it is just within the Envisioning project, we definitely had a range of advisors from different parts of the world. And indeed, that kind of need to shift the large-scale global imaginaries was really a key point. And so Manisha, I completely agree that, and I would say the other side is also true, that there's a lot of practices happening in the global south that are key indicators of other ways of living that we can draw on. So note taken, and also I think what can we learn as well from also traditional practices in many of those places. Louis.
So I'm going to start with a little story. We're working with a mayor in a mega city in a developing country who wants to get a huge shopping mall, the biggest shopping mall in the sub-region, because they feel that the title has been taken from them, and they're giving a permit for that. And so we try to talk him out of it, and he goes, no, he's going to do this. He doesn't want to listen. And then I tell him, so how about this? You ask for at least 30% of the mall, or even 25% of the mall, to be dedicated, space in the mall to be dedicated for recycling shops, or for used goods. And so people can participate. It doesn't all have to be new and shiny. He goes, then it takes away the prestige of the mall. And then I say, all right, how about this? You say you gave an equal amount of space for local produce to have a market in a premium place as well in the city. And he goes, no, but that would invalidate the whole idea of this being a modern city. This is the understanding that decision makers have of what development really means. It means moving away the things that mean something to us, that contribute to community, and bring in place something new and shiny, which they think helps them compete in an increasingly globalized economy. So how do you get 1.5 down to this level? I'll start amongst us, and this is quite a problem we have as researchers or as advocates. We've been so consumed by this economistic thinking that almost all the recommendations we're making are calculated using economic parameters. If you keep talking about energy use in terms of savings, if you keep talking about food waste in terms of how many dollars, if you keep talking about leisure in terms of affordability, the only parameters you allow people, the only tools you allow people to participate with is their wallet. And we know very well that a majority of the world is consuming, or it doesn't have enough of the size of a wallet that can allow them to participate in an economy of this dimension. So in an attempt to solve the problem, we've somehow entrenched the exact system that is causing the problem. Now, most of what we think about in terms of sustainable consumption literature out there is influenced by two things. One of it is this economistic thinking. The other one is footprint analysis. And it's the reason why we keep talking about food mobility, housing every day, and then we talk about save, or peripheral things like changing light bulbs. What we have before us has no patience for this kind of tweaking. So we need to start conceiving of research work, rethinking society, bringing to the table visions, ways of seeing things that are not captured in dollar signs, and are not necessarily captured in the weight of food waste. All of these are important. They do matter. It's the language people understand, but we need to start introducing a new vocabulary a new language with which people can interpret the urgency that is here. The second thing, it seems to me that we're trying to take approaches of what CNN is doing. How do we get viral videos? How do we get this kind of traditional communication to talk about something that doesn't go through this sort of media? What we really need to do is to go to crisis managers and ask them, how do we start communicating this as a crisis? Because just the approach we're taking so far is not going through. And we need to start admitting that we probably don't like the word failing, but we need to really start grading our effort to see whether we've managed to move the needle at all.
Thank you, Louis. And Halina also wanted to contribute to
Yeah, I wanted to add something. Louis, you might tell your what was it, the mayor of a big city, give that person pictures of shopping malls in the US that one after another are closing down and failing economically because people shop online much more. And these failed shopping malls all over the country now, both in the Midwest and on the Northeast, different cultures, same problem, are being turned into sort of like small villages of dense housing and playgrounds and so on. So actually there is a shift away from the big shopping malls. So tell your mayor that his or her shopping mall is going to fail probably, and there is nothing worse than a deserted shopping mall in the middle of an elegant city. So that's one thing. Second, to answer the question about speaking to the local authorities, I have to say that I see where I live a very promising change. People in the wealthy community where I live, including the city officials, are increasingly interested in the question of consumption and embodied energy, and asking me, because I'm the chair of the Citizens Energy Commission in my city, asking me to give talks about it, and are totally, they totally understand the issues. So I don't think everything is so bad. We just have to take advantage of these changes and give them a trajectory toward the beacons. So that's what I see.
Thank you, Halina. So my own contribution to the discussion was that Bill McKibben yesterday in the Boston Globe wrote about climate, and of course after 40 years so little has changed in the right direction. And he points at three things. One is the fossil fuel industry. The second is the newly emerging technological solution in terms of renewable energy. And the third is the emerging climate movement, especially under young people. And this is all great, but he doesn't really mention consumption. And he doesn't really mention our own lifestyles and how we contribute to the big part of the. So the question is, if we even are not able to get Bill McKibben on board in communicating our own lifestyles as part of the issues, and to communicate solutions in terms of what Vanessa and Manisha and others just mentioned, I think we have to do a big thing in terms of communication, and especially targeting high-level figures, not only policymakers and decision makers, but even people like Bill McKibben. So please, can you be brief, because we have a few more questions. Vanessa or Louis?
Yeah, this is a great point, Philip. And I think one of the things we're looking at with the Beacon is we talk about both making waves. So in the communications, how do we start getting new ways of thinking about sustainable ways of living, but also riding waves. So where is the conversation happening right now amongst local policymakers, amongst key thought leaders like Bill McKibben, and how do we actually start to shift those? And I noticed, Garrett, that you also spoke about this in the chat box. Garrett was part of the team that worked on the communicating and fostering and communicating sustainable lifestyles report and other reports together with us. You know, that the challenge is really about not getting consumption in the public dialogue. It's there, but it's through advertising and marketing of existing systems of provisions. So how do we counteract them? How do we create attractive, accessible options? And these kind of cultural influencers, like what you're mentioning, Bill McKibben and others, are really critical key people. So I would say absolutely part of what we're starting to document within the Beacon Project is where are the big conversations happening, like Manisha said, around smart cities and imaginaries, but also who are these cultural influencers and how can we start to support them in framing the climate and sustainability crisis in this way. So Garrett, I don't know if you want to add anything to that in terms of the work you've done on influencers.
Garrett, do you want to speak? You have to unmute yourself. If not, we move on, and
I've got you unmuted, Garrett, I think, or maybe we just did it at the same time. I have you unmuted if you wanted to say something more there, but it could be that.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, we can hear you, Garrett.
No, well, first of all, thanks. I really have really enjoyed this conversation. It really covers the richness of all of these experts who are involved in this. But the work that we're all talking about is really looking at the consumption and how we're currently consuming. And it's already happening. So the lessons to be learned on how it's happening, how we can tap those skills that are involved, because it's around, just as the, echoing comments that have been made, it's cultural influencers, it's figuring out how not necessarily to change the trends of the large dinosaurs, but to work with youth and new emerging brands of tomorrow or entrepreneurs of tomorrow, and sort of use that energy to try and figure out how we can meet our needs differently. Because I think you need to plant the seeds for what is going to take the place of the current systems of provision now, and not necessarily just try and analyze the current systems and sort of describe them, but what are going to be the alternatives, and investing in those and figuring out what they might look like. But these are just some initial thoughts. I've actually just been enjoying listening to all the presentations, though I've read the book. It's nice to hear it presented. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Garrett, and great hearing from you. So we had a remark from Rosa Struber to everyone. Rosa, do you want to speak up? Rosa suggests yes.
Hi, thanks a lot for your great presentations. It was really, really interesting, both of that. I've been working in the field on sustainable lifestyles for almost 10 years now, and I'm a bit torn, I have to say. I think it's a great approach, obviously, to have these positive messages and all the, show the solutions that are out there and show all the positive developments. But at the same time, especially looking at Lewis numbers, I just feel we are really not advancing fast enough, and the change we're seeing is so marginal and so much in the niche still, that I'm concerned we're probably still, this is maybe just not enough, and we'll not be fast enough. So I'm with a lot of interest following the movement of Fridays for Future in the different countries, because I feel the arguments that I put forward here of this intergenerational equity aspect of the young people, telling it to the faces of their parents and of policymakers that basically their future is at stake, which, it will be. I think that's a very strong point, and I'm not quite sure about the other countries, but at least here in Germany, I see that this is, receiving a lot of attention. And I think this is an argument that is a bit more difficult to just push aside. We are all aware of all the cognitive biases we have towards climate change and the long-term effects and the effects in other countries. But I just feel this direct connection to our own generation of children is a very powerful one. So I'm just wondering if this might be one of the waves maybe you were describing to connect with and to support. We have this movement here, at least in Germany. I'm not sure if that's international, on the Scientists for Future. And as said, this might just be one nice way to put it forward.
Great. Rosa, I just wanted to say, absolutely, I agree that I think looking at the shift and the transformation that we're faced with, putting it into the context of our intergenerational responsibility and what we've inherited also from our ancestors is a critical way kind of to move this forward. Louis, do you have something to add to that? Because you've been thinking a lot about the kind of scope and scale of what the report is saying.
Maybe not add, but try to say. So we're giving lots of examples, and we're having a conversation. When Rosa, for example, says she's worried whether we're going to get there fast enough, I like the framing, fast enough, because there's a lot happening. The question is whether the good is happening faster than the bad, to put it in very simplistic terms. And the good really needs to happen faster than the bad, and fast enough for us to overtake it in time. And it's really that equation, whether that is what is happening right now. This is really the question we need to ask. And I also, lately I begin to think a lot, why is a country like Sweden praised so much for being an exemplary society? Because there's men and women are more equal, social people are more, they have, I mean, the social circumstances, the welfare system is much more accessible and so on. But you really cannot claim that this is a sustainable society, right? Because there are probably three key things if we're talking about sustainable lifestyles. One is living within the ecological limits. We all know this. Two is fairness for everybody, so you don't consume more than someone else's share. And the third one is well-being. Even living within ecological limits, you need to pursue the good life. If we do not have these three in place, we have just well-being and we have some kind of fairness, but you're not within the ecological limit. We cannot talk about a sustainable lifestyle. And to me, it's a real test whether the examples we're giving, we can claim that this is sustainable living. And in most cases, I really doubt. Now, what we're beginning to realize more and more, especially part of the conversation we had in trying to publish this report and in the other project that Vanessa referred to, is that we have models we bring to the table that are based on our experiences in westernized societies, where things are organized in a particular way. You can easily get data, you can easily follow the law. If you don't follow the law, there's a system on how you get punished and all of this. This is not really how more than 50% of the world lives. I would even argue that just about 30% of the world lives like that. Most of the rest of the world just functions in a different way. And we need to start going there to understand how it works rather than imposing an approach that we understand, which is not necessarily solving the problem. In fact, it is exacerbating the problem. I think part of what I've started doing lately is challenging other researchers that we need to start thinking differently. Until we think differently and reframe what is going on, then the others will not pick up on it. We cannot afford to sit and console each other that we have the solutions when we really do not have them. It's not being trying to alarm people or anything. It's just looking whether the numbers add up, and they don't.
So we have some. Oh, Sylvia, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I want, but it sounds you have some others in the queue first. Sorry for.
Well, I do. I have Valentina and Jeffrey and Jaco, and I would actually like to give Jeffrey at this point the floor, because Jeffrey points out that these powerful forces that take our attention away from what we are talking about here. Jeffrey, can you be very brief? Sophia, you have to mute yourself because Jeffrey?
You're top.
Okay. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, you're on now.
That's way too, you're asking way too much. Reductions. Okay, reductions and ideas. I've been thinking about the whole kind of global media communications with not just in news and information, which that's already kind of one area where people get their information. My thinking is like how this kind of conversation that goes on and these initiatives that we're highlighting are more like exceptions rather than the rule, of course. And in terms of like, how do you capture attention? Like the as Garrett was saying, like with the advertising industry focuses on capturing attention, and they have very sophisticated methods for doing that. A lot of it is constant hitting people over the head over and over again with certain kinds of ideas and memes and that kind of thing. And it's like this battleground, you know, in terms of attention, and people are constantly hit with messages about saying, here, you should do this, you should do this. And we're like kind of caught in that. So the kinds of strategies, the kind of communication strategies that are required are, of course, different now than they were, say, even 10 or 20 years ago, because of the changes in the internet. The news media has changed its ways of doing things. They're competing with the traditional kinds of forms don't work anymore. They have to switch to the internet, and so people, in terms of people's lifestyles and behavior, you know, you could see it everywhere. You know, people are like looking at their phones rather than talking to people around them. So anyway, now I'm going off. I'm talking.
Jeffrey, thank you. I'm
talking too much about this.
No. I now want to go to Valentina, because she commented directly on you, Jeffrey. And after that, I want to give Jaco the floor, and then we have to go to close. So first, Valentina. Hi. You have to unmute yourself. Yes. Very, very brief, Valentina.
You're on, Valentina. I've unmuted you. Go
Oh,
ahead.
thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Hello, everybody. Good to be on. Thank you, everybody, for the presentation so far. Super interesting comments as well. And thank you also to Louis before I go to my reply to Jeffrey, because we have been using the 1.5 degree report already in our NGO work to communicate sustainable lifestyles to high school students. So that was the missing piece so far. But no, coming to Jeffrey, I think one of our experiences in how to catch young people's attention, especially, that works quite well, is the trick to use existing frameworks. So kids go to school, they have to sit there anyways and listen usually. So one, I think, leverage point is to use that frame of the school and fill it with some meaningful projects that actually allow interaction and participation of young people on topics like sustainable consumption and production. And yeah, so I think that is one way. Of course, you run often into, again, systemic issues like the same with like every system. The schools were built a long time ago, and then they don't have actually often the space to have open discussions. The teachers are very under time pressure to convey their curriculum, and then of course it's not always that easy, but it is one approach, and I wonder how we could use that more often in the SCORAI community to kind of tap into this
Yes.
world of.
And I would like to encourage you, Valentina, to write about your project of schools and travelers for the SCORAI listserv. I'm sorry I have to be very brief. So Jaco, and then we close off with Vanessa and Louis. Jaco, very brief, if you can.
Hi, this is Jaco. Yeah, most of the points that I wanted to make in response to the interesting discussion and presentations that have been going on is I put most of that in the chat box already.
Right.
They say what I could actually maybe emphasize is that, say, within the Glamorous project, we had a lot of discussions. It was a large project, but one of the discussions that we had to say, all we do is actually for the 15 to 20 environmentally aware percent of the people that are motivated to do voluntarily something extra and are open for all the ideas that we are discussing here. The problem is to get transition is the other 80%. And the kind of discussion we had on that is that you may need different approaches for different phases of such transitions that we need for SCP or circular economy or sustainable lifestyles. That would be that another group will be sensitive to economic incentives. And it's also seen that in the energy transition, for instance, in Germany, that people took the solar panels because it was also economically beneficial for them. And when you come to the next group, there it's a social norm-like approaches. So the other ones are doing that, I can't stay behind, might get more important. And the current discussion still focuses very much on the first group, what we can do and learn from there. But we talk quite little about, say, getting how to handle with the great majority of the people. And I think that still, well, stays a very important point. And I had also some nice experience with visioning and with working with practice-oriented approaches and citizens and consumers. But we're familiar with that. But I think I would like to add this point to the discussion.
Thank you, Jaco. And I have to apologize to Jack because he wrote about the empty malls and what to do about it. And you can read it, and he would like to work with us on this particular issue. But because of the time, we need to close the webinar very quickly in a few more times. So I want to give Vanessa and Louis each 1 minute to give their final comments, and then we will close it. Vanessa?
Yeah, so I'll just use my moments to say that I agree with Rosa and Sylvia that we should connect this Beacon for Sustainable Living and work with the Fridays for Future group to get a different generational perspective, and also to gain from their perspectives in terms of that kind of mainstreaming that Jaco was speaking to. And just as a final thing, this has been such a rich discussion. Thank you to all of you and for the work you do. We'll be in touch, and I'll let the SCORAI listserv know when the Beacon process is online, but also be in touch with you separately about it.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Louis?
Thank you so much for coming. The report I presented, if there's anything that comes out of it, I hope it's not just that people get overwhelmed and they suddenly feel like this cannot be solved. Rather, I hope it brings some kind of a sharper focus on where we need to put our efforts so that we know exactly the kind of impact or the return on investment we're getting from it. So far, we've not been very clear about the role of lifestyles or the impact of lifestyles when it comes to the broader unsustainability problem. But I hope this is at least beginning to help us understand that a little bit more clearly, but also begin to sharpen the lens of how to bring people's lives, everyday living, to get people interested in this and to take the kind of action that is necessary to improve our well-being. We are now working on launching phase 2 of this. It's still in somewhat of a design phase. So we welcome ideas that might help make this much more useful than what we have there. So again, thank you so much.
So thank you again, Vanessa and Louis, for your great presentation and your great work. And I love this webinar. I mean, this is what SCORAI is. This new ideas, open discussion, mutual endorsement and reinforcement of what we are already doing, and looking forward to the future, and being very optimistic in the end that we actually can achieve what we want to achieve. So thank you all. This will be online on the SCORAI website. We will announce when it is available. And thank you all for your time on crazy early days in the morning, Manisha, and crazy late in Friday evening in Japan, Louis. So bye-bye, everybody, and see you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Bye.
Bye.